Hello. I've decided to do this short video to assist you with Chapter 3, which is the research method. I want you to also know that Chapter 3 is not a place for general discussion or broad opinion. Chapter 3 is the blueprint for how your study will be conducted. So Chapter 3 has to be strong. It has to be a strong chapter because you're going to provide detailed information. It should be detailed enough that another researcher could follow the same steps and repeat your study. Excuse me. Also, this chapter requires time because you must think through your research design. You must think through your design, your population, your sampling, your data collection, your data analysis, validity, and ethics. The new due date, again, is May 24th. Okay, so in this video, I will explain the purpose of Chapter 3 and why it must be specific, identify the required sections and minimum page expectations, connect research design, population, sampling, data collection, and analysis. And I want you to be able to understand why the data analysis plan is the most detailed section in Chapter 3. And I also want you to recognize some of the common mistakes that could actually weaken your Chapter 3. So I don't want you to I don't want you to copy the template headings and fill it in with a few sentences. Now, each section must explain exactly what you will do and why. Okay? So Chapter 3 must show an alignment. Whereas you're going to show your research problems lead to the purpose. How the purpose leads to the research questions. How the research questions lead to the design, and how the design leads to the methods. So I want to encourage you to use this outline as a checklist as you write and revise Chapter 3. So in Chapter 3, you as a researcher, you will be moving from what I want to study to how I will study it. So the methodology must be concrete. You should avoid vague phrases such as data will be analyzed or participants will be chosen. That's too vague. You must explain the exact process. Okay? So Chapter 3 protects the credibility of your study because it shows that you, the researcher, has a thoughtful and ethical plan. So a reader should never have to guess what the researcher will do, whom or what will be studied, how the data will be collected, or how results will be interpreted. Here you see is a roadmap to Chapter 3. The intro, the minimum requirements for these sections I will go over. Intro, half page. Design section, 1 to 3 pages. Methodology, half page. Population, half page. Sampling and sampling procedures, minimum 1 page. Data collection, minimum 1 page. Intervention, minimum 1 page. Archival must be 1 to 3 pages. Intervention, 1 to 2 pages. Data analysis plan, 3 to 5 pages. Now, the data analysis plan is longer because it must explain exactly how your data will be prepared, how your data will be analyzed, and how it's going to be interpreted. Threats to validity. You're going to have the external, internal, and construct. The minimum is half page. Ethical procedures, the minimum is 1 page. Summary, the minimum is a half page. So the introduction to chapter 3. You're going to restate the purpose of the study that you have in chapter 1. Okay? Then you will preview the major sections of chapter 3. You're going to set the tone for the method chapter. A strong introduction usually ends with a preview sentence naming the major sections in chapter 3. For example, you can use this student prompt. In chapter 3, I will explain the research design, population, sample, data collection procedures, data analysis plan, threats to validity, and ethical procedures. And the research design and rationale. This section must do 2 things. 1, name the research design and defend the design. So naming the design alone is not enough. If you say that your study is qualitative, the reader still needs to know whether it is a case study, whether it is a ethnography. The reader needs to know more detail, not just qualitative, but you have to give more detail. Now, if your study is quantitative, the reader needs to know whether it's going to be correlational, whether it's going to be descriptive, causal comparative, experimental, or even another design. So the design must match the research questions. For example, a why or how question often points toward qualitative inquiry, while a question about relationships or differences may point toward quantitative methods. So the design is the research strategy. The rationale explains why it is the right strategy. In the methodology overview section, it acts like a bridge between the design and the specific procedures. In this section, you should briefly describe the sequence of your study. Excuse me. For example, first, you as a researcher will identify eligible participants. Second, participants will be recruited. Third, consent will be obtained. Fourth, interviews or surveys will be completed. Fifth, data will be analyzed. So this overview prepares the reader for the detailed sections that follow. So you're going to use specific steps, not general statements, specific steps. In the population section, the population is the larger group from which the sample will come. Okay? So a population is not simply people or businesses. It must be clearly defined. For example, a strong population statement might identify small business owners in Washington, accounting managers in nonprofit organizations, or publicly traded retail companies from a specific period. If you're using archival data, the population may be documents, It could be reports, records, or organizations rather than human participants. And the sampling and sampling procedures. Sampling is where you could possibly lose clarity, but don't be discouraged. You can do it. In this area, in this section, you must identify the sampling strategy, and also you must explain the actual selection process. For qualitative studies, purposeful or criterion sampling is common because you, the researcher, probably will need participants, or you're going to use cases with direct experience related to the topic. For quantitative studies, sample size may need to be justified with a power analysis. That's where you get into more statistics. So you should also include inclusion criteria such as job role, years of experience, location, industry, or even date range. And with exclusion criteria, you can use individuals or records that do not meet the study requirements. In the data collection procedures section. Now, this section must be written in sequence. You should explain what happens first, what happens next, what happens last. If you're going to use interviews, you should discuss your recruitment process. How did you get your consent? You have to include scheduling times that you met with the interviewees. You must include recordings if you have recordings, or transcription and storage. So if surveys are used, you should discuss how you distribute the surveys, how you collected them, and how you handle the responses from your survey or questionnaire. For archival data, if you're using that, you should discuss the source. Where did you get them? How did you get access to them? Did you download them? How did you retrieve the information? What were the dates that you retrieved or downloaded this information? And how are you going to store the data? How are you going to organize it? So you should avoid saying only data will be collected from participants. That's too vague. Be more detailed. More detailed, giving steps, sequences. Okay, in this section, although it is optional, but I want to warn you, just because they're optional doesn't mean that you may not need these sections. Okay, so you want to be extremely careful with this area, because once I receive your chapter 3 and realize that these sections should have been there, then you could lose a lot of points. Okay, so if you're not conducting an intervention, then leave it out. If you're going to use existing data, cases, the archival data section becomes very important to you. Again, if you're using existing data, you're using secondary data, you're using cases, this section, the archival data section, becomes very important. It's important for you because the reader must know where the data came from and why it can be trusted. I need to know where you got the data from and why I can trust that the information you have is correct or credible. So if you're conducting quantitative or mixed method, and you're using instruments, you're testing, okay? Or you're using programs, or you're manipulating your variables, you must describe those materials carefully. So the goal is clarity, not unnecessary headings. Now, the data analysis plan. Now, this part right here is very, very, very important. The data analysis plan is the strongest and most detailed section in Chapter 3. If you're using any type of software like Excel or SPSS or manual coding, you must have this information in this section. You should explain how you will clean the data. How are you going to check for missing information? How are you going to organize your files? How are you going to organize the codes, the code responses? How are you going to do that? Or how are you going to prepare your variables? Also, which is important, you must restate your research questions. You must restate your research questions. If you're doing quantitative or mixed method, you must restate your research questions and your hypotheses, so I will be able to see the alignment. Then you must also explain the exact analysis method and why it is appropriate. So the goal is to show how your study will answer your research questions. So here I want to explain to you the qualitative, quantitative, and mixed method studies, how they are actually analyzed differently. Okay? So in qualitative work, you could be using coding, categories, themes, pattern identification, memoing, document review, interview analysis, and credibility strategies. You're going to explain themes if you have themes, how those themes will answer your research questions. Okay? So again, in qualitative work, you should describe coding, theme development, document analysis, and how credibility will be protected. In quantitative research, you should describe statistical procedures, and also justify why each test, the test that you perform, why these tests fit the variables and the hypotheses. In mixed method work, you must explain both sides, meaning you must explain qualitative side and you must explain the quantitative side, because you're doing mixed method. And you're going to explain how both sides and how the results will be brought together. I want to remind you that analysis should be planned before data collection, so the study remains organized and defensible. Again, the data analysis should be planned before you start collecting your data. Okay, the next section is threats to validity. Threats to validity. Every study has threats to validity. Every study. The mistake is not admitting them. You, as a strong researcher, you must identify possible threats and explain how they will be reduced. How are you going to reduce those threats? Let me explain external validity. External validity asks whether findings can be applied. Can they apply outside your study? Can those findings be applied outside your study? Internal validity asks whether the design allows the researcher to make reasonable conclusions about relationships or differences. It addresses history, selection, bias. Construct validity. Are you measuring what you claim to measure? That's the question that you as a researcher should answer. In other words, construct validity asks whether your study, truly measures the concept it claims to measure. So for qualitative studies, you may discuss credibility, transferability, dependability, confirmability, where appropriate. Okay? So validity is not about pretending the study is perfect. It is about identifying weaknesses and explaining how they will be handled. In the ethical procedures section, this is another section. Well, all of them should be treated seriously, but ethics must be treated seriously. If you're using human participants, meaning you're interviewing people, you must discuss if you have informed consent. Do you have a written consent? Are they volunteering? And the consent, actually, it's a document stating that the participant is voluntarily participating. They also have the right to withdraw from your study. However, with archival data, if you're using that, you still need to explain your data access, your permission, your confidentiality, and secure storage. You should explain where data will be stored, who will have access to them, and when will they be destroyed. If you're studying your own workplace, so to speak, you must address power differences and conflict of interest. So the ethical procedures are not a formality. They protect both the participant and you as the researcher. And last but not least, it's a summary and transition. The summary should not introduce new information. It actually brings closure to Chapter 3 and prepares the reader for Chapter 4. You should summarize the major method decisions in a brief but complete way. The transition sentence is important because it shows movement from planning the study to presenting the results. So I want to encourage you to keep your summary focused and professional. An example of your transition sentence, of course, that section has to be a half page, but your transition sentence could be something like this. Chapter 4 will present the results of the data collection and analysis described in this chapter. Okay? Okay, let's wrap this up. I want to remind you that the extension is not extra time for you to delay. It is extra time to conduct a thoughtful research planning. So I want you to use this checklist before you submit chapter 3. I want you to pay close attention to the alignment between your research questions and your data analysis. If your research questions ask one thing, but your analysis plans test something else, your chapter 3 will be weak, meaning that you will lose points. Also, it is very, very important that you proofread carefully. Proofread carefully and ensure that all required sections meet the minimum page expectations. Also, please make sure you follow the outline, follow the template for chapter 3. One other thing, again, the new due date is now May 24th. Thank you.